Welcome, everyone. It's great to see you all here. You've just been listening to La Cale Bateau by Mauritian artist and rapper Lion Clash. That is on your resource list, and he's from the island of Mauritius. So good morning, everybody. Good morning. My name is Elsa Wiehe. Can you all hear me? Great. I lead the Boston University African Studies Center Education Outreach Program. I want to warmly welcome all the teachers and educators. Welcome to the students who are here as well. And I believe there may also be some folks from Mauritius in the room. So to everybody, if you haven't done so already, please take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat box. And if you teach, maybe say where you teach, what you teach, and where you're located, definitely, because I think this is an international group. The event today is organized by the Boston University African Studies Center, which is a national resource center in the United States for the study of Africa. The Boston University Center is federally funded by a Department of Education Title VI grant. So we have a public mission to serve educators across the kindergarten through 12th grade spectrum with resources and events that expand perspectives on our wonderful, beautiful, magnanimous, multifaceted Africa. Our goal today is not only to support increased knowledge about the continent, but also deepen the accuracy of knowledge about the continent and the humanity. So it's with this spirit and commitment that we're offering this session today on histories of enslavement and resistance in the Indian Ocean. For those of you who may have registered in the last few days in our, I was going to say late, but it's never too late, registered in the last few days, I wanted to share our resource list right here online. Dr. Allen will be referring to this as well, so to some aspects of the resource list, so make sure that you click on it. For the next 2 hours, we are going to follow this agenda, which was playing at the beginning. I won't take too much time to go into it on detail, but that's our plan for the morning and the afternoon if you're located in Mauritius. And before I introduce our speakers, I wanted to start off by saying that this topic has relevance not only for the world history classroom and the social studies classroom in the United States, it has relevance for people in Mauritius, and it has relevance for me personally as someone from Mauritius. My own life histories are deeply intertwined in this history. And I'm committed, and I'm offering this workshop today to break the silence on this topic, both in the United States and Mauritius, in the ongoing work towards reparations and towards justice. I also want to acknowledge that this topic is difficult and emotional for all of us who are here today and who are grappling with how to teach this and what reparations mean for today in 2023. So joining me today are two outstanding and renowned scholars on this topic. Both have done tremendous work. So joining me to do this work today are two outstanding and renowned scholars. Both of their scholarships and their life work have been a fuel for my life and my own activism, and both are leading voices. So I'm first going to introduce Dr. Teelock, who is joining us from Mauritius 8 hours ahead of US Eastern Time. Dr. Teelock is a leading historian who formerly taught about at the University of Mauritius. On the island, she has played a crucial role in promoting public understanding about slavery. She has led multiple public projects about slavery, including being the vice chairperson of our Truth and Justice Commission. And she now is leading the charge on the International Museum of Slavery. She has published numerous books and articles, including Transition from Slavery in Zanzibar and Mauritius with Abdul Sharif, Bitter Sugar, Sugar and Slavery in 19th Century Mauritius, a select guide to sources on slavery in Mauritius, and Slaves Speak Out, the testimony of slaves in the era of sugar. So Dr. Teelock is going to speak in the second part of this session today. In the first part of the session, Dr. Richard Allen, who is joining us. Are you in Framingham, Richard? You're muted.
I'm in Worcester.
You're in Worcester, who is joining us from Worcester, will lead us with some really important framing on this topic. Dr. Allen was equally, for me, a key scholar in my own learning. Dr. Allen is a historian, now retired from the University of Framingham. He's the author of numerous books and publications, including the foundational European slave trade in the Indian Ocean, 1500 to 1850. He was the editor of the Indian Ocean Studies series and has held numerous fellowships and research grants, including a current project with the NEH titled Global Passages, creating a public database of slaving voyages across the Indian Ocean and Asia. And he was also a special consultant on the Mauritius Truth and Justice Commission, among many other public history projects that have benefited the US scholarly community and also Mauritius. So please join me in welcoming both Dr. Teelock and Dr. Allen. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Allen. Take it away, Richard.
Thank you, Elsa. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to engaging with you as I bring the good news of the Indian Ocean world, right, to the educational community. More than 50 years ago, historian Joseph E. Harris noted that the African diaspora of slave origin extended eastward across the Indian Ocean and not just westward across the Atlantic. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, an eyewitness account probably written during the first century of the Common Era by a Greco-Roman merchant based in Egypt, confirms that enslaved Africans were trafficked in the northwestern Indian Ocean at least 1,500 years earlier than in the Atlantic world. Despite an expanding body of scholarship on the African slave diasporas in the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and South Asia, slavery and African diaspora studies remain in thrall to what historian Edward Alpers aptly characterized 25 years ago as, quote, the tyranny of the Atlantic. This Atlantic centrism is a manifestation of another conceptual problem in slavery and African diaspora studies, namely what I've referred to as, quote, the tyranny of the particular, close quote, by which I mean the inability or unwillingness to situate the specialized case studies that dominate these fields in more fully developed local, regional, pan-regional, and comparative contexts. An attendant propensity to view the transatlantic slave trade as a unique historical phenomenon obscures the existence of slave diasporas that funneled millions of enslaved African men, women, and children into the Mediterranean world, the Middle East, South Asia, and elsewhere over the centuries. A preliminary census of non-Atlantic slave trades confirms the longevity, multi-directionality, and globality of these activities. An estimated 3 million Muslim and European slaves, for example, were transported across the Mediterranean between 1450 and 1850, while perhaps 6 to 6.4 million slaves of Central Asian origin reached the Black Sea region, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Ottoman Empire between the 11th and 19th centuries. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved Indians and Persian Shiites arrived in Central Asia between the 13th and 19th centuries. Conservative projections suggest that Indian merchants shipped at least 600,000 slaves to Southeast Asia between the 15th and 17th centuries, while Danish, Dutch, and French ships carried as many as 140,000 enslaved Indians towards Southeast Asia, the Mascarene Islands of Mauritius and Réunion, and South Africa during the 17th and 18th centuries. Long-distance slave trading flourished in Southeast Asia as well. An estimated 660,000 to 1.135 million slaves arrived in the Dutch East India Company's Southeast Asian establishments during the 17th and 18th centuries, while the years between 1820 and 1850 witnessed perhaps 386,000 to 437,000 exports from various islands in the Indian Ocean, or pardon me, in the Indonesian archipelago. And basically, of course, the message here is that we're dealing with something which is a global phenomenon on a massive scale. The difficulties inherent in reconstructing these non-Atlantic trades help to explain why, quote, a history of silence, as my late friend Hubert Gerbeau aptly characterized it, has long surrounded them. These problems include a scarcity of archival materials compared to those that exist for the Atlantic, and the often fragmentary and problematic nature of those sources at our disposal. These evidentiary constraints mean that the study of slavery and slave trading in the Indian Ocean and Asia, including the African slave diaspora in these regions, remains in many respects still in its infancy. And what I would like to do now is to turn our attention to these three major non-Atlantic African slave trades, which is to say, of course, the Saharan, Red Sea, and Indian Ocean trades. The Saharan, Red Sea, and Indian Ocean trades' importance in African diaspora, and global history rests not only on their antiquity and magnitude, but also on what they reveal about the complexities of the human experience with chattel labor. Although historians usually examine these three trades separately from one another, the frontiers between these geographically defined trading zones could overlap, and indeed these trades became increasingly integrated through time. And we see this especially in the latter part of the 18th and into the 19th centuries. The slave trade from sub-Saharan West Africa into North Africa and the Mediterranean world began more than 3,500 years ago. The difficulties of crossing the Sahara confined this commerce initially to the Nile Valley. Little is known about the slaves from Nubia, and here we're talking about the area, of course, encompassed basically by the modern Republic of Sudan, who reached Pharaonic Egypt during the Old and Middle Kingdoms, but large numbers of enslaved Nubian prisoners of war reached Egypt during the expansionist New Kingdom, which was from 1558 to 1080 BCE. And indeed, Nubian slaves continued to flow northward to Egypt for centuries thereafter. The magnitude of this traffic is difficult to ascertain, but its volume is suggested by the fact that tens of thousands of military slaves of sub-Saharan African origin served Egyptian rulers between the 9th and late 12th centuries. Ahmed ibn Tulun, who became the independent ruler of Egypt in 868, for example, commanded an army that reportedly included 40 to 45,000 sub-Saharan African slave soldiers. Nubia and the Upper Nile Valley continued to supply slaves for the Egyptian market well into the 19th century. In 1820, Egypt's ruler, the famous Muhammad Ali, ordered an invasion of northern Nubia, not only to acquire territory and access to Nubian gold, but also to procure 20,000 slaves for the modern army he sought to create. Subsequent Egyptian conquests and raids in the central and upper Nile Valley generated large numbers of captives. During the 1830s, for example, an estimated 10 to 12,000 slaves reached Egypt each year. These regions continued to supply a large number of slaves for both the Egyptian and Red Sea trades into the 1870s and beyond. Thousands of the slaves who reached Egypt during the mid-19th century were also subsequently exported from Alexandria to Constantinople. And indeed, overall, some 16 to 18,000 African men and women reached the Ottoman Empire each year during much of the 19th century. The Nile Valley was the easternmost of the 6 major trade routes that funneled slaves from sub-Saharan West Africa to North Africa and beyond. The introduction of the camel into North Africa in the first centuries of the Common Era permitted Arab merchants to cross the Sahara and reach the central Sudan in the mid-7th century, where slavery was an already well-established institution. Contemporary accounts confirm that this trans-Saharan trade was well established no later than the mid-10th century. The empires of ancient Ghana, Mali, and Songhai participated in this commerce to varying degrees. Slaves figured much more prominently, however, among the commodities trafficked northward from the central Sudan, where Kanem Bornu, the fourth of the great West African empires, held sway. The Saharan trade's volume cannot be determined with any certainty. Contemporary observers rarely reported the size of slave caravans crossing the desert. A notable exception, of course, is the famous Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta, who traveled from Mali to Fez during the winter of 1353-54 with a caravan that included 600 female African slaves. Other accounts indicate that the Ottoman province of Tripoli, in what is now modern Libya, often exported 2,000 slaves each year during the 18th and 19th centuries, and that Morocco may have imported as many as 7,000 to 8,000 slaves each year during the early 19th century. When viewed in its totality, the information currently at our disposal suggests that perhaps 7.4 million slaves crossed the Sahara between 650 and 1900. And here I would ask you to take a look at Table 1, which gives you a breakdown on this traffic by time period. The Red Sea slave trade drew captives from a catchment area that included the Horn of Africa, which is to say modern Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia, and the Upper Nile Valley. Inscriptions and temple friezes indicate that slaves from the, quote, land of Punt, close quote, which was probably the northwest coast of Somalia, reached Egypt by sea before the 18th dynasty, which was from 1550 to 1292 BCE. While the periplus of the Erythraean Sea confirms the antiquity of the Red Sea trade, little is known about this traffic during the first millennium of the Common Era. The rise of Islam, the attendant expansion of Muslim merchant networks, and the demand for agricultural and other labor in Arabia expanded this trade as the Red Sea became the principal commercial artery linking the Eastern Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean world. The Dahlak Islands, for example, near the port of Massawa on the Eritrean coast, became an important slave trading hub between Ethiopia and Yemen from the 10th to 15th centuries. The increasing number of slaves from Eastern Africa, known as Sidis and Habshis, who reached India from the 12th through 14th centuries, attests to the Red Sea slave trade's increasing integration with transoceanic trade networks in the Western Indian Ocean during this period. The creation of the Portuguese Estado da India between 1500 and 1515 and the Ottoman conquest of Egypt in 1517 heralded the beginning of a new era in the history of the Red Sea trade, one defined by greater state involvement in this traffic. Large numbers of Sidi or Habshi slaves continued to reach India into the mid-17th century, a period that also witnessed an influx of East African, Malagasy, and Comorian slaves into the Red Sea region to satisfy the local demand for labor. The region's increasing integration into the developing capitalist world economy after the mid-18th century spurred the trade's explosive growth during the 19th century. This growth was facilitated by the increasing use of steamships and the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, which permitted ships belonging to Ottoman, Egyptian, and European-controlled companies to transport slaves directly from Yemen and the Hejaz to Constantinople. Once again, as with the trans-Saharan trade, it is impossible to gauge this trade's volume with any accuracy. Available information suggests that the Red Sea trade consumed an average of 1,000 to 2,000 men, women, and children each year between 800 and the end of the 18th century. And here I would refer you to table number 2, which gives you a sense of these estimates. And it's after this period, of course, that the volume soared rather dramatically, despite British efforts to suppress this traffic from the 1870s onwards. Enslaved Africans continued to reach Arabia well into the 20th century, which is something, of course, that many people do not realize. Saudi Arabia, for example, did not ban slave imports until 1936, and smuggled slaves continued to be landed on the Arabian and Yemeni coast even during the 1950s. The origins of long-distance slave trading in the Indian Ocean world remain shrouded by the mists of time. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea reports that merchants ventured as far south along the East African coast as Rapta, an emporium probably near the Rufiji Delta in modern Tanzania during the first century of the Common Era, but does not mention slaves among the commodities acquired there. Although East African slaves may have been exported to the Persian Gulf region beginning in the 3rd century of the Common Era, this traffic became much more fully developed during the 9th century, when Arab or Muslim merchants began to export sizable numbers of slaves to Arabia, the Persian Gulf, and elsewhere. Like the Saharan and Red Sea trades, the volume of the Indian Ocean trades cannot be determined with any certainty. Current estimates suggest that Arab or Muslim or Swahili merchants exported 1,000 East African slaves each year from the 9th through 17th century, with the number of such exports increasing dramatically from the mid-18th through 19th centuries in response to the growing demand for labor created by the introduction of capitalist forms of production in the Western Indian Ocean. And here, again, I would refer you to Table 3 for additional information on this. The Estado de India's creation heralded the beginning of European participation in the Indian Ocean trades that continued into the mid-19th century. The Portuguese exported slaves from various places along the Mozambican coast to India, with some even ultimately reaching the Portuguese settlements at Macau in China and Nagasaki in Japan, as well as the Spanish-controlled Philippines. The Dutch East India Company, which of course is oftentimes referred to as the VOC, shipped East African and Malagasy slaves to its administrative, commercial, and other establishments in Southeast Asia and coastal Ceylon, as well as its colony at the Cape of Good Hope during the 17th and 18th centuries. British East India Company, and I'll refer to them hereafter as the EIC, ships transported Comorian, Malagasy, and Mozambican slaves to its settlements in India, Java, and Sumatra, and its colony of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. French ships began to acquire slaves along the Malagasy, Mozambican, and Swahili coasts in the late 17th century, most of whom reached the Mascarene Islands of Mauritius and Réunion. Contemporary accounts of colonial Mauritian life and an 1817 Mauritian slave census provide us with some insight into the ethnic diversity of the Africans trafficked in the Indian Ocean world. These records reveal, for example, that Malagasy slaves came from among 13 ethnocultural populations, while those from Eastern Africa originated among 14 populations that can be readily identified, as well as others whose modern identity cannot be ascertained. The volume of this European trade remains difficult to determine with any precision. Portuguese ships reportedly carried, quote, great numbers of Mozambican slaves to India at the end of the 16th century, but the number of such exports declined during the 17th century and apparently averaged only 125 to 250 men, women, and children each year during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Information about Dutch exports to South and Southeast Asia is also limited, but the VOC's use of 4,000 African slaves to build a fortress at Colombo, Ceylon during the late 1670s suggests that the company acquired significant numbers of East African and Malagasy slaves at times during the 17th century. The VOC also mounted sporadic expeditions to Madagascar and Mozambique to procure slaves for the Cape Colony during the 17th and 18th centuries. British slave trading in the Comoros, Madagascar, and along the eastern African coast remained minimal, with only 51 known confirmed or probable voyages between 1622 and 1772. Census data suggest that an estimated 311 to 358,000 Malagasy East African men, women, and children were exported to the Mascarenes between 1670 and the early 1830s. When viewed in its totality, the information currently at our disposal suggests that Europeans trafficked at least 398,000 to 487,000 African and Malagasy slaves in the Indian Ocean between 1500 and 1850, estimates that future research will undoubtedly increase. The significance of this European activity is suggested by two facts: that Europeans accounted for approximately 1/2 of all Eastern African slave exports into the Indian Ocean world between 1500 and 1873, while the Mascarene trade consumed 20% of all slaves trafficked by the French between 1670 and 1848. The economic impact of these trades is indicated by recent research, which suggests that Malagasy, Mozambican, and Swahili merchants earned the very impressive sum of 7 to 11 million Spanish silver dollars, or piastres, between 1770 and 1833 from the sale of slaves destined just to the Mascarenes. What I'd like to do now is to turn our attention to the factors that contributed to the demand for enslaved African labor. And here it's important for us to appreciate that there are going to be various factors that shape this demand, which is, of course, going to be satisfied by the three trades that I've just been talking about. In addition to serving as menial laborers, some African slaves in Renaissance Europe served as objects of conspicuous consumption, who, because of their perceived, quote, exoticness, reflected the power and wealth of princely or royal courts. African eunuchs were equally highly valued in the Middle East and elsewhere in the Islamic world as harem slaves, in part because the 80 to 90% mortality rate among men and boys when they were castrated made them relatively scarce and expensive. Physical characteristics and purported cultural traits also influenced the demand for slaves from specific regions or populations. Nubian women, for example, were prized as concubines in Arabia because their dark skin was perceived to be, quote, cooler to the touch in a hot climate than that of lighter-skinned women. The East India Company preferred Malagasy slaves, who they considered to be more intelligent and trainable as artisans and craftsmen than slaves of other origin. In the Mascarenes, on the other hand, Malagasy slaves were considered to be troublesome because of their propensity to run away from their masters, while Mozambican slaves were deemed fit only for hard physical labor. Inadequate supplies of local labor and the high cost of employing free workers also shaped the demand for African slaves. Officials at the EIC's company at Bencoolen in Sumatra, for example, complained regularly about the expense and the difficulties of controlling indigenous craftsmen and artisans. The company sought to address these problems by shipping Malagasy slaves to the factory, some of whom were trained as blacksmiths, bricklayers, carpenters, coopers, and other kinds of crafts. Elsewhere, slaves were used in various productive capacities, especially those requiring hard, if not dangerous, physical labor. Thousands of African slaves drained the salt marshes near Basra in 9th century Iraq, while others dug and maintained underground water systems in Arabia, dived for pearls in the Persian Gulf, and cultivated, harvested, and processed commodities such as cloves, coffee, dates, pepper, and sugar on plantations in the Mascarenes, the Moluccas, the Persian Gulf, and Sumatra. Men slaves also manned Arab dhows and Indian and European ships and worked as skilled craftsmen and artisans in urban centers. Although women toiled alongside men as agricultural field hands, female slaves usually served as concubines, domestic servants, and workers in household manufacturing activities such as weaving. A prominent feature of this diaspora was the use of hundreds of thousands of Africans as slave soldiers in the Middle East and South Asia between the 9th and mid-19th centuries. In addition to Egypt, rulers in Morocco, Yemen, and India made extensive use of such soldiers. Moroccan Sultan Moulay Ismail, for one, commanded an army in the early 18th century that reportedly contained as many as 150,000, quote, blacks. Reports that Ahmadabad in Gujarat housed 5,000 Habshis between 1526 and 37, and the chief minister of Ahmadnagar Sultanate in the Deccan purchasing 1,000 Habshis during the latter part of the 16th century suggest the presence of substantial numbers of slave soldiers in India as well. Some of these slave soldiers became prominent political leaders. A Habshi slave founded the Najahad dynasty in Yemen in the early 11th century, while Malik Ambar, the most famous Ethiopian-born slave soldier in India, became the de facto ruler of the Deccani state of Ahmednagar during the early 17th century. The Portuguese also used African slave soldiers to defend the Estado de India, while the British sometimes employed African and Malagasy slaves as soldiers or armed guards in South India, Sumatra, and Ceylon during the 18th and early 19th centuries. Let me begin to wrap this up. Although millions of enslaved Africans crossed the Sahara, Red Sea, and Indian Ocean, historians of slavery in the African diaspora paid little attention to these trades, despite estimates that 12 million or more men, women, and children were exported from sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean, Middle East, and South Asia, a figure comparable to the estimated 12.5 million exports to the Americas. These non-Atlantic trades' importance becomes even more apparent if the hundreds of thousands of slaves trafficked between various locales along the eastern African coast, especially during the late 18th and 19th centuries, are included in this figure. Zanzibar, for example, housed an estimated 15,000 slaves in 1819, a number that soared to between 70 and 100,000 between the 1830s and 1870s in response to the demand for chattel labor generated by the dramatic growth of the local clove plantation economy. Slave mortality rates that averaged 15 to 20% a year mandated the importation of 9 to 12,000 new slaves every single year just to maintain this Zanzibari workforce, a figure that climbed to perhaps 15 to 20,000 slaves each year during the late 1850s and into the early 1870s. Enslaved men, women, and children from Mozambique, the Comoros, and elsewhere along the East African coast likewise reached Madagascar in large numbers during the 19th century, with an estimated 400 to 700,000 such imports between 1821 and 1895. These trades legacies continue to resonate in the early 21st century. Iran, India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka are home to sometimes sizable minorities of Eastern African slave descent. The socio-political malaise associated with the Creole population of African and Malagasy descent in modern Mauritius reflects a growing awareness of the slave trade's magnitude and impact. The legacy of these Indian Ocean trades even extends to the United States, where African Americans of Malagasy descent maintain a distinctive sense of identity grounded in an awareness of their slave ancestors' origins on the Grande Île. This consciousness and recent research underscore the need to delve more deeply into the nature and dynamics of these trades. Individual biographies not only reveal these enslaved men and women's humanity, but also invite us to compare their lives with those of the enslaved Indian and Asian peoples who coexisted with them in the Indian Ocean world. Interdisciplinary research promises to provide insights into these trades not found in the archival record. DNA analysis, for example, has confirmed that the East African origins of India's Sidi communities and is beginning to shed greater light on the ethno-cultural origins of those trafficked across the Sahara. Archaeology is also helping to diminish the history of silence that has long surrounded these trades. Excavations on Trois-Moulins, 350 miles north of Mauritius, for instance, have yielded information about the survival strategies used by the Malagasy and East African slaves who were marooned on this 200-acre islet for 15 years after the French slaver Utile was wrecked there in 1761. The caves near Shimoni on Kenya's southern coast have, in turn, yielded information about how slaves were held for export during the 19th century. The complexities inherent in the Saharan, Red Sea, and Indian Ocean trades mandate that we adopt more expansive approaches to reconstructing their history. That American, Arab, which is to say probably Omani, Portuguese, and Spanish, as well as French and Mascarene-based ships carried slaves to Mauritius and Réunion, highlights the need to transcend the nation-based studies that have hitherto characterized scholarship on slavery and slave trading. So too does the fact that voyages to supply Mauritius and Réunion with East African slaves were financed or facilitated not only by French and Mascarene mercantile interest, but also by Indian merchants in Mozambique and Goa. In addition to supplying the unbleached cotton cloth known as Merikani that clothed Zanzibari slaves and was used to purchase captives in the East African interior between the 1830s and the mid-1860s, American ships participated in the illegal slave trade that flourished in the Western Indian Ocean during the first half of the 19th century. That they did so serves as a powerful reminder that we must cast aside the conceptual myopia that afflicts slavery and African diaspora studies and acknowledge that a multiplicity of actors and forces interacted to shape what we must now view as a truly global African diaspora of slave origin. Thank you very much.